I'm here to talk to you about why culture matters and what Christians should do about it. And I got 4 points, but I want to warn you that they are not of equal length, so don't try to keep track or add it up or project when I'm going to end. Point 1, what is culture? The Latin word culture meant to not leave nature as it was, but to make something of it. And for many, many years, actually centuries, culture always meant agriculture, horticulture. It meant not leaving nature as it was, not just eating whatever came up out of the ground. It meant actually tilling the ground and planting certain things and making something of the ground so we ate better. And so for centuries, culture meant making something of the actual ground, the natural world. But then, by the 17th century, culture started getting a broader sense of the word, and it began to mean educated. In the 17th century, people said we shouldn't leave human beings just the way they are. We shouldn't leave human nature the way it is. We need to expose human beings to literature and philosophy and art. And the idea of higher education and becoming a cultured person comes into being. But by the 20th century, the word culture began to be used in a comprehensive way. And that's how I'm going to use it today, and how most people use it today. Sociologists and anthropologists would say that culture is the shared beliefs and values, the shared conventions and social practices of a subgroup or an entire society, in which we're taking all the raw material, everything in life, and rearranging it in order to express meaning, in order to express what we think is the good, the true, the real, and the important. So, everybody knows when you think of culturing the land, you don't leave the ground as it is, you till it up and you plant and then you eat what comes. But what's music? Class. Music is taking the raw material of sound and putting it together in such a way that it not only strikes the emotions, but actually also becomes the glue for certain societies. In other words, music is taking the raw material of noise, as it were, of sound, and turning it into something, not leaving it just as it is, but cultivating it. Or, for example, what are stories or theater? It's taking the raw materials of human experience and fashioning that into narratives. Or, anything that is a cultural artifact. Let me give you cultural artifacts. Art, obviously. Technology is a cultural artifact. You're taking something and making something new out of it. But by the way, legal arguments, medical policies, all stories. A fictional story means I'm taking raw material and I'm rearranging it what? To say something about what I think is true and real and important and good. And therefore, that's really what culture is. Culture is rearranging the material world, the raw materials, in order to say something, in order to express meaning in some way. Now, that's what culture is. James Hunter, by the way, says that culture is the power to define reality. And that's let me get to point 2. How do Christians understand culture? What's culture making when it comes to Christian thought? And the answer, of course, is that Christians believe that culture making is taking the raw material that God has made, and there's potentials in that raw material, and we're drawing the potentials out, and we're rearranging material for human flourishing and human thriving as God defines it. Now, I'll get back to that in a second. As God defines it. But now, biblically, culture making is something that biblically is a good thing. Adam and Eve are put into the garden as what? Gardeners. And by the way, all culture making is basically a form of gardening. When you create music, you're taking the raw material and making it into music. When you create a story, when you create anything, you're taking raw material. Same thing as a garden. You're taking the raw material and you're tilling it and you're cultivating it and you're fertilizing it and that sort of thing. The original people, Adam and Eve, were gardeners, and that means they made culture. But if you see, as soon as Adam and Eve pass off the scene in Genesis chapter 4, you'll see people making culture. You'll see art and technology, except, of course, it's violent culture because it's culture not under the influence of God, but under the influence of self, and under the influence of love, but of power. But of course, even later on in the book, we know, the book of the Bible, we know that God, even though culture making tends to be something that he made human beings to do, and often that culture is destructive, yet God doesn't just raise up his people to be prophets and priests. Who's Daniel? Who's Joseph? Who's Esther? These are people that God raised up and gave them so-called secular jobs. They brought justice and wholeness into a secular field. And so the Bible indicates that culture making is good. But let's get back to what I just said I was going to get back to. Every single culture is basically the rearranging of material in such a way that we express the meaning of things. Every culture is pointing to values. Every culture is saying, this is what's good, this is what's true, this is what's beautiful, this is what's real, this is what's important. And when I say Christians are supposed to make culture, we're supposed to make culture, we're supposed to rearrange things for human flourishing. And by the way, everybody says that. I think I heard Gabe already say it, that we're here for the common good. We're here for common good. But you realize that that is a loaded term. That is a value-laden term. When anybody says, I want to work for the common good, you need to know that they have a working definition of common good that's based on all sorts of underlying beliefs about what human beings are for, why we're here, where we're going, what is important for human beings to live for. And therefore, we don't agree on what human flourishing is. We don't agree on what the good is. So for example, I told you that I gave you 8 examples of cultural artifacts. So for example, art or technology, creating an organization, or writing a philosophy paper, or a story, or an ad. Every ad is a cultural artifact. Every legal argument, every medical policy. Why? Because let me give you 9 examples of different cultural understandings of what is good. Some cultures and some cultural artifacts say individual choice and happiness and self-expression is more important than supporting the group or community standard. It's more important that the individual be happy than you support community standards. Other cultures and other cultural artifacts say it's the other way around. The importance is that the individual sublimate his or her self-interest for the good of the family. Which is it? The 2 different views of good. Or, secondly, some cultural artifacts tell us that the material world is good. Some cultures say the material world is an illusion. Other cultures say the material world is the only reality. Which is it? And I want you to know that all cultural artifacts they're assuming one of those views. Or thirdly, is sex dangerous and a necessary evil? Or is it only for family or community? Or is it a form of self-expression? Is money basically a way for you to get your family up in the world, or is it a mode of self-esteem? Let me put this in the form of questions. Is society basically an aggregation of individuals, or of families, or of tribes? In other words, what's the basic building block of society? Differing answers, different cultures. Medicine, law, ads, art, everything's different. Or is history basically moving in a direction of progress? Are things getting better and better? Or are things getting worse and worse and we've come down from some golden age? Or is history a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury signifying nothing? Or is it cyclical? Which is it? See, different cultures believe different things about history, and it comes out in all the cultural products. Or is morality self-authorizing? Basically, does the individual decide what is right or wrong? Or is morality or moral values embedded somehow in the cosmos of the universe, and it's our job to discover them and align ourselves with them? Is human reason sufficient to answer all questions, ultimately? Or is it not, and therefore we have to depend on revelation from God or tradition or something like that? You see, our understanding of time, our understanding of art, our understanding of government, rationality versus intuition and experience, all these things, which is most important? Every culture is coming down somewhere. Every cultural artifact is coming down somewhere, because culture is rearranging the raw materials of life, everything from clothing to food, everything from law to medicine, everything from art to philosophy, and everything is being rearranged in order to express meaning and to say, this is good, this is true, this is beautiful, and this is not. And I just gave you something like 30 or 40 different views of different things that are the underlying values and beliefs beneath every single culture and every cultural artifact. Christian culture making is just like any other kind of culture making, except Christians try to discern what is God's view of the relationship between the individual and the community. What is God's view of the family? What is God's view of sex and money and power? What is God's understanding of history? What is God's understanding of rationality? What is God's understanding of identity? What is God's understanding of society? What is God's understanding of morality? And then by getting that sort of deep into our hearts and psyche, you just go out in the world and you do what everybody else does, which is you make culture. Because if you work, you make culture. If you do anything, pretty much, you make culture. So that's point two. Point one is, what is culture making? Point two is, what is Christian culture making? It's pretty much the same thing, except Christians understand that there are very different views of the common good, and we are seeking to help all human beings thrive, not just us Christians. But we're seeking it necessarily in terms of definitions of the good that God gives us. Now, point three, and this is the shortest point by far. Should Christians, therefore, engage culture? Should Christians try to make culture? Should Christians think that culture making matters and we should try to do it? And I think now you know what the answer. This is the shortest point. The answer is, unavoidably, Christians will be making culture. The real question is, are you just going to go with the flow? Are you just going to be doing what everybody else does? Are you essentially going to be creating culture that is based on non-Christian understandings of the good, of society, of history, of identity, of morality? Or are you going to be really, really thoughtful about it and try to actually let your culture making be influenced by your faith? So the question is not, should Christians make culture? The question is, of course, will they do it well or not? See, that was a short point. Point four, what's the way forward then? If it's unavoidable, and as I think you realize I'm implying, most Christians are not thoughtful about it. In fact, one of the things that's frightening to me is if I go down that list and I say, Christianity has a different account, for example, of every one of the things that I just said, by comparison with secularism, Western secular individualism, and also Christianity is very different than traditional, more hierarchical and communal cultures. Christianity is really rather unique and rather different. Most people gulp because actually they're just out there working and not really thinking. So point four is, how can we move forward? Here's how we can. Here's 4 ideas. First of all, I think it's very important to start with that Christians get a nuanced understanding of the mixed nature of all culture and cultural artifacts. Now, I know I can do this quickly, but this might leave some questions in your mind. Nevertheless, I'll try to do it best I can. Every single culture every human being is made in the image of God and is fallen. That's true of Christians and non-Christians. Every human being is made in the image of God, and the Bible says in Romans 1 that we all have some kind of inherent, innate sense of God's reality. Even those of us who really don't know we believe in God, according to Romans 1, every human being is made in the image of God. We've got some innate goodness and knowledge. And what that means is that both non-Christians and Christians, when they make culture, the cultural artifacts are always mixed. Romans chapter 1, this is a very famous verse, says this about, this is verse Romans 1:20. Since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so men are without excuse. But the words being understood and are seen are present passive participles in the Greek. And what that means is that every human being, even if the people who don't believe in God, as they're making culture, it essentially says that there's a continually fresh, insistent pressure on all human beings, on their consciousness about the reality of God. And therefore, lots and lots of non-Christians create cultural artifacts that you can tell, if you know your Bible, are pointing to biblical truth, or pointing to some of these realities. Meanwhile, every Christian who tries to make culture, to some degree, because of our sin, will be distorted. Because the idols of our hearts, because we love money too much, or we love career too much, or we love our own culture, our own white culture, our own African-American culture too much, or in other words, because of the idols of our heart, our cultural artifacts will always be imperfect. Non-Christians' cultural artifacts will always have something good in them, and to have that nuanced approach to culture is crucial for Christians. You've got to be able to appreciate what's good in everything, and you've got to be non-triumphalistic about what you produce. Crucial, critical, number one. Number two, the second thing is you probably need to blend the insights of the main parties that you're going to read about if you're a Christian and you read about Christ and culture. There's the worldview transformationist party that tends to be confronting of the culture, saying we have the Christian worldview and you don't. There's the justice, common good party that says we just got to get out there and love people and care for the poor. And there's the just build up the church party. That's the important thing, is that you build up the church and not get too distracted by culture making. We got to build the church up, and we worship and gather, and we do that. And all three of those, by the way, all three of those views have a lot to say. An extreme version of any one of the three leads to be over-confrontational or over-assimilationist or overly withdrawn. But all three of them have got something important, and you need to blend them all together. Thirdly, our cultural products as Christians need to both defy and resonate with the culture. Not only resonate, because then you're just giving in. Not only defy, because nobody will listen to you. You've got to do both. And you know, when Friedrich Nietzsche says, and he argues constantly, that great philosopher, that if you believe in human rights, and if you believe you need to care for the poor, and if you believe in the equality of every human being, he says, then whether you know it or not, you're a Christian. You may say you don't believe in God, but you're a Christian. If there is no God and the universe is impersonal, and we all got here just by eating one another, the strong eating the weak, it's just crazy to think that if we're just the product of evolution, that we should love one another. One Russian philosopher said, this is the way a lot of secular people reason. Man descended from apes, therefore let us love one another. And Nietzsche says, there can't be a God. If there's no God, then human rights don't work. But most people are going to say human rights do work, and therefore you can say, you've got something that I resonate with. I believe in human rights too. Here's where it comes from. One last thing. We can make culture because God has made the world to be remade by culture makers. Mark Knoll, in his book, Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, puts it like this. Who formed the world of nature, which provides the raw material for physical sciences? Who formed the universe of human interactions, which is the raw material of politics, economics, sociology, and history? Who is the source of all harmony, form, and narrative pattern, which is the raw material for art? Who is the source of the human mind, which is the raw material for philosophy and psychology? And who, moment by moment, maintains the connection between our minds and the world beyond our minds? God did, God does. Christianity gives us the reason that culture making works and a motivation to do it. Thank you very much.